Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in. We are almost through week 4 of our 5-week course, so we are actually getting towards the end. Just one more week to go and a couple more things to cover. We move into our next genre pretty soon. So as I'm recording this, we're right kind of in the middle of our creative nonfiction workshop. The posting deadline has passed. You might have noticed you got just a partial grade, so don't worry, not your final grade by any means for that workshop. I'll update them once we've passed the feedback deadline, which is this Friday, June 24th. Okay, and then we turn around pretty quickly into Monday, hoping that a lot of folks can actually do this feedback sooner than the Friday necessarily. The groups were fairly small, so it's a fairly manageable task, I think. And then looking to Monday, which is the beginning of our last genre that we look at, poetry, and is again, like we've done before, just kind of like a bit of a primer, a warm-up for doing our last workshop, a poetry workshop. You'll notice that the groups are a little bit bigger, not huge, but a little bit bigger for this final workshop that we do, just because the poetry that people tend to write and submit, I mean, you might do like a page of a poem or maybe a couple of poems on a page. So we're looking at like 1 or 2 pages of work for people to deal with rather than sometimes 5 or 6 or whatever the longer stories might have been. So that's the reason for that. And again, there's no requirement that you have to write in a form or you can do this, you can't do that, anything. Again, we're looking for the application of like the rules of creative writing, probably some things you'll pick up in Unit 9 from the textbook reading, but also the course material here. And again, you feel free to write like a series of shorter poems or one slightly longer one. You're not locked into just one very short poem. So poetry is, if there was like one genre that I had to declare myself more specialized in than the others that we've covered, which would be a sort of artificial thing to do, but I suppose it would be poetry. That's what largely my background is. A lot of my publishing is in, so that's kind of where I fall. And so that's a preface to the statement that I'll make here, is that poets, of course, will often claim that if you can write poetry well, you can write, or at least learn to write, in almost any other genre well, whereas the flip is not always true. And of course, it's poets who say that, so take it for what you will. But the point is that in poetry, there's such a like intensity of language or compression of language. Literally, there's just sometimes so few words to work with. Even in a long poem, you know, the word count is so much less than even a short story. Now, certainly there's such things as epic poems where the word count, I mean, it's a huge book of one poem. But for the most part, poetry depends on this real like intensity of language. There can be no extra words in there, or they really show up as just kind of extra baggage, they're dead weight in there. So you really have to be careful in poetry, I mean in every genre really, but in poetry especially, just because it's so naked on the page there. Any parts that aren't working well or contributing to the whole will really stand out pretty glaringly. And so it's obviously an exercise in the craft of writing, which is fundamentally what we've been doing all along, but maybe in its most kind of pared down, purest form as we get into our last genre. I think it's intentional that we end with this genre because I think it's one of the most challenging to do well, but also it's the one that comes with so much kind of like baggage behind it. We have so many ideas sort of like culturally about what poetry should be. It has to be formal and about elevated things and blah, 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 none of which is true. Or we feel that in poetry we have to tackle these grand philosophical questions. Also not true. We think that poetry has to rhyme. Also not true. In fact, I would caution against rhyme. It more often than not works against a poem rather than contributing to it. It doesn't mean that rhyme can't be important or that the poem can't have a sort of musicality to it. But if you're just using simple end rhymes like C, me, be, you end up writing the poem in such a way that you can arrive at that word. So the rhyme controls the thing rather than contributing to the effect of like how it sounds to the reader. So we have a lot of preconceptions about what poetry should sound like, what its topic should be or subject matter should be, how it should look on the page, and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that we're looking to dispel here. And again, if we start with this, then people are often very tentative and they just make sort of half an effort, not because they're lazy, but they're just kind of unsure. But at this point in our course, even our short 5-week course, you're hopefully feeling a little more confident with your writing. You've had the opportunity to test some ideas out, some strategies, some techniques, and now you can really sort of put them into practice here. Okay, so it'll be set up, the usual workshop way, but I'm just going to pop us into Unit 9 here, which is kind of like our warm-up for the poetry workshop. Oh, you may have noticed a little feedback thing here. I'm always interested to hear about people's experience in the course. Nothing super, fancy or time-consuming here, so do that when you get a second, and then we'll look at the poetic mind. Pardon me, I sneezed. Okay, so this is like not necessarily my favorite movie, but it's one of my favorite movie moments. It's from an older movie called Contact with Jodie Foster, who I really like. That's a whole separate story. And it's actually a good movie. It's fun to watch the whole thing. And this scene here is a lot more impactful when it's in the context of the whole movie. Excerpted here, it's like I say, it's a little bit corny, but if you're like immersed in the movie, it makes a lot more sense. And I won't totally give it away, but you can watch it and you'll see why it validates my life's work. Okay. So then there's a reading assignment, talking a little bit about like how poetry works. What are some of the, again, like I mentioned, preconceptions or misconceptions about it. And then our main content is going to have us thinking about something that I've called the poetic mind, but it's about the creative mind, but also really about like how poetry works as a form of language and how it works on the page, not just how we think about it. So we're going to look at T.S. Eliot, famous American-born turned British poet, wrote things like The Wasteland and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, something that a lot of you have probably run into before. And rather surprisingly, a much more contemporary advertisement for HP, which features the singer from No Doubt, Gwen Stefani. So we'll look at how that works. Okay, so I'm going to have you read in this ebook here. I love these ebooks. They just like exist in Blackboard. It's so convenient. From an essay by Eliot called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And the title kind of gives it away. It's his meditation on the idea of a poetic or a literary tradition, all the works going backwards from, Homer up to now. And the individual, like how does the new writer fit into tradition? Do you have to make a total break from it? Do you embrace it? Do you, what do you do with it? So it's kind of long, and it's kind of like in that slightly older, early 20th century style, so it takes a little bit of slogging through. But I've kind of pointed you to these places that I want you to look at where Eliot talks about the poetic mind, or like how to think creatively, or how to formulate good poetry and how it works. So again, I'll let you work through that and find this area where he talks about the poet's mind. And then, very surprisingly, I fell out of my chair when I first saw it, you'll see that fundamental idea reworked in this totally different context, this 30-second advertisement or whatever it is. But it really is like a restatement of the idea that Eliot expresses in Tradition and the Individual Talent. So to some degree, it's probably just coincidental. It's entirely possible, though, that the folks who are the ad agency working on this were English majors. So it's not totally far-fetched. They probably didn't sit down and think, we should make a commercial that uses tradition and the individual talent. I'm not suggesting that. But if they're, have they gone through literature and creative writing courses, because so many English majors do transition into advertising or PR of some kind, they may have run into this idea, and so it informs the way that they want to present this particular advertising scheme. So I don't doubt that there's some connection, although I'm not going to suggest that it's literally they sit down and think, Eliot, finally our chance to make a commercial for with Gwen Stefani, who says some stuff just like T.S. Eliot would. I'm not going to say that. Okay, then I'm going to ask you to read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. One moment, please. Oh, signing out of Skype is so sad. Okay, which again is a poem you might have run into before. You'll find it probably difficult in some parts, but that's exactly the point, because what I'd like you to do then in our discussion board is answer these series of questions in well-developed paragraphs where we're kind of reflecting on the ideas from Eliot's essay, their restatement in the HP ad, your experience of reading the love song here, and then how some of the ideas might feed into the poetry writing that you're going to be doing, of course, for Unit 10. So see how it all sort of leads into our next workshop. All right, so again, be really conscious to provide good feedback, pros and cons. Don't be afraid to point out areas that you had questions about or what you thought might have been weaknesses. You could even frame that as just like, here's an alternate suggestion, right? So you don't feel like you're saying that one is better, but just here's another way of doing it. Throughout the works that people have submitted for our creative nonfiction. So really make that effort to make the feedback as useful as possible, and then hopefully you'll be getting that same kind of feedback. Then we'll turn around to Unit 9 here, and then get into our final workshop, Unit 10, and honestly that takes us pretty much to the end of our course. Notice that our final due date is about as far out as you can get, at the very, very end of the term, the official end. Likely people will want to finish it before then, but it takes all of the time available to us to get through the material we want to get through. Okay, so as always, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and I will otherwise talk with everybody soon.